Charlotte's body felt impossibly heavy, tangled in unfamiliar sheets that carried a scent she didn't recognize, masculine, musky, intoxicating. The sharp morning light cut through the room like a cruel spotlight, illuminating the unfamiliar surroundings. Her pulse quickened, panic tightening around her ribs as she struggled to piece together the events of the night before. Then, she saw him. No, 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 no. Lying beside her, his bare back rising and falling with steady breaths, was Lucas, her husband's best friend. A wave of nausea crashed over her as the memories surged forward, laughter over clinking glasses, stolen glances across the table, the warmth of his hand on her waist when she nearly stumbled. Her stomach twisted violently. How had she let this happen? She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. But when she opened them, the horrifying reality remained. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with guilt and the remnants of a night she couldn't take back. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to catastrophe. Her husband, Daniel, had no idea. Neither did Lucas's fiancé. Charlotte clutched the sheet to her chest, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. She had just made the worst mistake of her life. It had all started so innocently. Daniel had been the one to suggest the night out, a small celebration for Lucas's recent promotion. Just the four of them: Charlotte, Daniel, Lucas, and his fiancée, Olivia. A casual evening, drinks, and laughter. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, somewhere between the clinking of glasses and the hushed conversations, something had shifted. Charlotte had dressed up that night, hoping to catch Daniel's attention. Lately, things between them had felt distant, not broken, but dulled. The easy intimacy they once shared had faded into late nights at the office, exhausted conversations, and a routine that left her feeling more like a roommate than a wife. She had wanted to remind him, to remind herself of the love they still had. But as the night wore on, Daniel had been glued to his phone, distracted, missing the small looks she sent his way. Instead, it was Lucas who had noticed. Lucas who had laughed at her jokes, who had caught her wrist when she nearly knocked over her drink. His touch lingering a second too long. She should have pulled away. She should have left early. But Olivia had gone home sick. Daniel had been absent even while sitting beside her, and the air between her and Lucas had started to crackle with something dangerous. The night had blurred into a haze of laughter, warmth, and the slow unraveling of boundaries Charlotte hadn't even realized she was crossing. It started small: an extra drink, a brush of hands when reaching for the same glass, a moment of lingering eye contact that should have meant nothing. But the way Lucas looked at her, as if she were someone fascinating, someone deserving of attention, stirred something inside her that she had tried to bury for months. Daniel had been distant for so long, lost in work, in responsibilities. She had spent countless evenings waiting for him, hoping he would see her, reach for her the way he once had. But it never came. And tonight, with Daniel preoccupied and Olivia already gone, Lucas had stepped into that empty space. His laughter was easy, his attention effortless, and Charlotte felt herself drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Then came the moment, the one she would replay over and over. A casual touch that lingered, his fingers ghosting over hers. A glance that lasted too long, the unspoken words between them thickening the air. And then, the shift when the line between right and wrong blurred so much, it almost disappeared. Charlotte sat in her car, her grip on the steering wheel tightening as she stared at the house she had built with Daniel. The porch light glowed softly, illuminating the familiar path to the front door. Yet it felt like a threshold she wasn't sure she could cross. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. The weight of the night clung to her, the scent of Lucas's cologne still lingering on her skin, a cruel reminder of what she had done. She wanted to believe it was just a mistake, a fleeting lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and longing. But deep down, she knew better. The way she had leaned into Lucas's touch, the way she had let herself drown in his attention, it hadn't been accidental. It had been a choice. And now, as she sat outside the home where Daniel slept, unaware of the betrayal lurking in the shadows, Charlotte felt the walls of her world closing in. forcing herself to move. She stepped out of the car and walked up the steps. She turned the key in the lock with trembling fingers, inhaling sharply as she stepped inside. The quietness of the house swallowed her whole. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. A stillness that only made the weight in her chest grow heavier. Across from her, Daniel sat with his head buried in his laptop, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. It was a sight she had grown used to, him lost in work, unaware of the storm raging inside her. She wanted to say something, anything, to reach across the table and confess the unbearable truth that had been gnawing at her since that night with Lucas. But every time she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat. How could she destroy the man who had given her everything? How could she look into his trusting eyes and shatter the foundation they had spent years building? Instead, she swallowed back the guilt and forced a smile. "Do you want more coffee?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Daniel glanced up, distracted. No, I'm good, thanks, babe." Charlotte nodded, pressing the cup to her lips to hide the quiver in her breath. The weight of the secret pressed on Charlotte like a vice, suffocating her, consuming her every thought. No matter how hard she tried to move past it, it clung to her like a shadow, an ever-present reminder of the mistake she could never take back. She went through the motions of daily life: grocery shopping, dinner with Daniel, weekend plans with friends, but nothing felt real anymore. Every moment with her husband felt like a lie, every shared laugh tainted by the knowledge of what she had done. Then, there was Lucas. She had told herself to cut ties, to erase the memory of that night. But avoiding him was impossible. He was always there, lingering at the edges of her life, his presence a cruel temptation. When they crossed paths, their conversations were brief, tense, filled with unspoken words and stolen glances. The guilt she carried was unbearable. Yet beneath it lay something else, something she refused to name. One evening, as she stood by the kitchen sink, Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "Charlotte, are you okay?" She turned to him, forcing a smile that felt paper thin. "Yeah," she lied, "just tired." But the truth was, she had never felt more exhausted in her life. The tension between Charlotte and Lucas was suffocating, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface of their carefully constructed lives. Every accidental brush of their hands, every lingering glance, every unspoken word only fueled the fire they were both desperately trying to extinguish. But it was impossible to ignore the pull, the magnetic force drawing them together even as guilt gnawed at the edges of their conscience. One evening, Charlotte found herself alone in a dimly lit bookstore, seeking solace in the quiet hum of pages turning and whispered conversations. She hadn't expected to see him there, hadn't prepared for the way her heart would lurch the moment their eyes met across the shelves. Lucas hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were fighting an invisible war within himself. Then, as if surrendering, he closed the distance between them. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte shook her head, already knowing where this would lead. "There's nothing to say, Lucas." But they both knew that was a lie. The weight of their choices, their unresolved emotions, was too heavy to ignore. The past wouldn't stay buried, no matter how desperately she wanted it to. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint glow of her phone screen, Lucas's name still lingering at the top of her messages. She had ignored his last call, the temptation to hear his voice battling against the suffocating weight of guilt pressing against her ribs. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart a war zone of longing and self-loathing. She knew this needed to end. The past few weeks had been a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions, of late-night phone calls where neither of them could find the courage to hang up first. But the secrecy was eating her alive. Every time she sat across from Ethan at the dinner table, she felt like a stranger in her own home. Every "I love you" that passed her lips felt tainted. Every touch a reminder of the betrayal she carried like an unbearable weight. With a deep breath, she typed out the words that had been circling her mind for days. "We can't do this anymore." Her hands trembled as she hit send, the finality of it sinking in like cold steel. But as she set her phone down, a sense of impending dread settled in her chest. Something told her this wasn't truly over. The truth had a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly Charlotte tried to hold it together. It started with small things: Ethan's lingering glances, his cautious questions, the subtle shift in his demeanor. She could feel it in the way he studied her when he thought she wasn't looking. The quiet hesitations in his voice. Then, one evening, it happened. She had just stepped out of the shower, her skin damp, when she saw Ethan standing in the doorway of their bedroom, his phone in hand. The expression on his face made her stomach plummet. Cold, distant, a storm brewing beneath the surface. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. Charlotte forced a smile, gripping the towel around her. "Okay, what's up?" Ethan lifted the phone, turning the screen toward her. A picture, her and Lucas, standing too close in the dim glow of a parking lot. Her breath hitched. She could feel the walls caving in. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," Ethan murmured. Charlotte's heart pounded violently. She opened her mouth to lie, to grasp at any excuse, but as Ethan's gaze burned into hers, she knew there was no way out. The truth had finally caught up to her. Ethan moved out within a week. The house, once filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and quiet moments of love, now felt hollow, like a structure left standing long after a storm had passed. Charlotte walked through the empty rooms, feeling the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her. She had always thought she could outrun the truth, bury it deep enough that even she could forget. But the truth had claws, and now it had shredded everything in its path. The silence was suffocating. The bed felt too big. The coffee tasted bitter. Every familiar scent, every framed photo, was a reminder of what she had destroyed. There was no grand gesture that could fix this. No apology strong enough to rewrite what had been done. Ethan hadn't yelled, hadn't begged for an explanation. He had simply packed his things, given her one last look, filled with a pain so deep it shattered something inside her, and walked away. She had thought losing him would be the hardest part. But the real agony lay in knowing she had been the one to push him away. And now, she had to live with the consequences of a mistake that could never be undone. Life is built on trust. And once broken, it is incredibly difficult to repair. In today's world, where distractions, temptations, and emotional voids often pull people in unexpected directions, it's crucial to communicate openly and honestly in relationships. If you feel unheard, unappreciated, or disconnected, address it before it leads to irreversible mistakes. No fleeting moment of comfort is worth losing a lifetime of love and trust. Instead of seeking validation elsewhere, invest in strengthening the foundation you've built. Learn to appreciate what you have. Because once lost, some things can never be regained, only mourned in regret.